Hello, this is Giulia Falato, and this is my contribution to the Youth in Chinese History video series. As you can see, the title for my presentation is "Voices from the Inner Quarters: A Preliminary Investigation of Female Education in the Late-Tang Period." So, this is still very much a research that takes moral instruction as its primary focus. Those who know my research interests will understand that this is usually my focus, but this is a project I am actually quite fond of, because it took me away for the first time from the late imperial period, and particularly in China, and the contribution of Jesuit missionaries to the introduction of Western learning, Western pedagogy, and so forth, to focus on something that I consider that has certainly had a more sort of endogenous focus, because it was, as we can see, it pertained to the the development and the development of the education and pedagogical theories and practices in a specific and very fascinating period, which is the Late-Tang period. This is a period of exceptional sociocultural transformation. For instance, we see the decline of the aristocratic families, the reform of the examination system, and of course the revitalization of Confucianism, particularly towards the end of the dynasty. We also see a number of dramatic upheavals, dramatic events, such as the Anlushan rebellion between 755 and 763, and more towards the end of the dynasty, the the so-called Huanchao rebellion, which both of these had obviously a major impact on how on kind of the decline of the elite families, and how they started to sort of perceive themselves, and how they could and the preoccupation around how to preserve their reputations. Of course, all these elements, particularly as I said, the preoccupation around families' reputation and the socio-cultural transformation, were obviously reflected in the education of children, given children's fundamental role in propagating the family line. So we see that new prominence was also given to female instruction, which was aimed at meeting the demands of the Tang family and societal changes that the era represented. And so I asked myself, what did it mean to grow up as a woman in the late Tang period? All these educational practices, to what extent did they were they affected by the socio-political changes, and how strong was instead the influence of the pre-existing tradition? And I'm referring in particular to the Han educational theories and differentiation of gender roles. Many scholars, and in particular a very renowned expert of sort of educational practices in the early Han period, which is Anne Kinney, argue that in China, basically all the theories around instructing children, they don't really reflect a general sense of or the pressures of for the future, or the necessity of change, but they are instead the treatment of children in pre-modern China. The treatment of children in pre-modern China was fundamentally invested in the past. Sorry, I was actually trying to paraphrase something that I've quoted, but the idea is that more than looking to the future and looking at how dealing with the challenges and the pressures of societal changes, usually what we see in throughout Chinese history is that education is something that is more it looks back, invested in the past, or looks back to the past. So this is something that I obviously agree with, and it has been confirmed by I believe most studies, that also most of the papers we have discussed in our workshop. But at the same time, it is also true that it is possible to identify in each era time-specific elements that character, and in particular in this case there were some, I was able to identify time-specific elements that characterized Tang female education and that reflected the diverse background of women who made up that complex and multicultural society. And so what did I do in this work? Well, I did mostly rely on texts that were written by women for women, so I made use actually of women's voices, and I made use of this corpus of nüxun, booklets for female instruction, all produced in the Tang period. And I particularly specifically chose to focus on the era of political turmoil around and after the An-Lushan rebellion, when growing anxiety for the fate of the dynasty brought about a revival of strict Confucian etiquette, which was reflected in the family and female instructions. This study took place a couple of years ago, so I have to I have to actually make a disclaimer, and I kind of have to acknowledge the sort of the limit of the sources consulted, which were mostly printed primary sources or sources that were available online, because it was basically written during the pandemic. But I believe that a more important sort of statement, a more important disclaimer, if you want, pertains to the prescriptive nature of the texts that I studied, which therefore cannot be treated as effective historical sources, since they only reflect evolution of societal values, mental constructs, and self-perception of a specific social group, rather than being objective accounts of children's lives in a given period. Therefore, the study won't venture into a micro-historical investigation of the actual living conditions of Late-Tang girls, but it will rather act as a testament of the social expectations towards young women of the time and how Confucian education was adapted to the ever-changing Tang society. So I thought this was an important premise that I needed to make. Going back to the corpus of texts that I consulted for this study, and in particular the nüxun texts, the nüxun tradition, we should point out that this is attested to since at least the Eastern Han period. So we're talking about roughly the 25th to the 220 year CE of the current era. And in particular, there is this first extant text, which most historians or experts of the early Han period certainly know, which is Ban Zhao's Nü Jie, Admonitions for Women, produced and composed around 100 of the current era. This text included is quite well known because it was included in the Hohan Shu, comprised a preface and 7 chapters that illustrated. I'm gonna go back. Chapters that illustrated. Okay, now I cannot go back. Anyway, the Fu Dao, the wifely way, namely the recommended conduct, domestic duties, relationship with one husband's parents-in-law, other members of the family, etc. So the usual full package. As we shall see in this examination, Nü Jie set the trends for its genre and became the source of inspiration for generations of nüxun authors. Ban Zhao's text, as pointed out by many recent studies on this topic, still enjoyed a widespread popularity among the Tang elite families, alongside Liu Xiang's Lian Yuzhuang, biographies of illustrious women, which, as we know, was also composed in the Han period. So these two texts basically made up the main canon of female instruction, mostly in the elite families, but in some ways it also circulated to a broader strata of the society. However, something that needs to be pointed out is that female instruction and etiquette were not the biggest concerns of the early Tang thinkers, but came to acquire increasing prominence as the political situation deteriorated and the aristocratic class began crumbling. This is something that we often notice in history. Moreover, following the changes to the examination system in the late 7th century, literary education acquired an increasing importance among families of these different social strata and was extended also to young girls as means to increase their chances of a good marriage. Okay, so this is the slide that I was actually looking for. The two official histories that we can see here mention the Jiutangshu and the Xintangshu. Jiutangshu compiled during the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, as we know, so roughly around the 10th century, and the Xintangshu was actually composed during the Song dynasty. And this confirms, these two texts confirm the increasing prominence and increasing circulation and availability of nüxun texts. We can see that in the elementary learning, so in the xiaoshui section, the xiaoshui section comprised obviously materials for the acquisition of characters and pronunciation, thus marking a differentiation between works on literary skills and conduct books, such as the Li Ji, the Xiaojin, so the records of rites or the book of rites, and the classic of filial piety, and obviously the Lunyu, the Analects, which were instead classified or listed in the Jin, so in the classic sections. With regards to female instruction, the two most authoritative canonical texts, which we have already mentioned, so Liu Xiang's Nie Lu Zhuan and Ban Zhao's Nu Jie, featured respectively in the history section, in the Shibu, and in the master section, so in the Zibu of the Jiutangshu, and were a testament to the increasing prominent status conferred upon female education. In the Xintangshu, we can see that the nüxun genre reached full maturity as it appeared as a standalone subcategory and came to include a number of innovative literary productions of the time. So it kind of detached itself a little bit from the canonical, Han tradition. For instance, we can see Empress Jiang Sun's Nüzi, so rules for women, and then for instance also the Nu Lunyu, the Analects for women, composed by the Song sisters, a text that we will delve more into in the next few minutes. The development of female pedagogical literature, which we have mentioned until now, undoubtedly reflected an increasing acknowledgement of educated women's contribution to the domestic and public sphere. As persuasively argued in a popular Mintang treatise, Tai Gong Jia Jiao, so Master Tai's Family Education, he basically says, as you can see in this quote, that not instructing girls when raising them is basically more or less, similar to raising pigs. So he says, if you don't instruct girls when raising them, you might as well be raising pigs. That's at least my interpretation. Thus, Tang families took the business of female instruction very seriously and once again entrusted this delicate task to mothers, who used their role to empower themselves as figures of domestic authorities and obviously as a way to make up for their exclusion from public positions. When mothers were not present, female tutors, so the so-called mush, or other family members took charge of their role, with fathers or other siblings acting in loco matris. And we have in this case the evidence, the example of Song Ruoxin, who is one of the two she's credited as one of the compilers of the famous Nu Lunyu, who has been always described as a strict instructor for her 4 sisters. So while in the early years of the dynasty, female instruction was mostly addressed to aristocratic ladies and focused on literary skills such as calligraphy and poetry, the mid and the Late-Tang saw, as we mentioned before, a revitalization of Confucian teachings, which resulted in the increasing production of books on moral conduct aimed at fostering education in the inner chambers. In order to, and here we can see the yes, sort of sorry. The next text will be actually one of the first texts that on which I base this study. So as you know, it's one of the most influential treatises addressed to young girls. It's called the nüxun, so the classic of filial piety for women, and another is one of the two texts, as I said, alongside the nüxun. This text was compiled in the mid-8th century by this lady called Madame Zheng, and addressed to unrefined, to her sort of in between quotes, Temeng, unrefined niece, who was about to become one of the prince's consort. As we can see, or as it appears from reading this text, it is actually a literary tribute to the Han canonical text Xiaojin, which had been the subject of new studies in the Tang period, and borrows from it in terms of structure and language, while also quoting obviously from Ban Zhao and Liu Xian's works. While the text gained more popularity during the Song dynasty, when it was rediscovered by publishers and made more widely available, so it's not really something that a text that was widespread during the Tang dynasty, I've still included it, I've decided to include it in my examination as a testament to the aristocratic education during the Tang period. This is instead, it's perhaps a more popular work in the sense that it was more widespread and circulated more broadly, called again nüxun, so another tribute to another famous canonical text, a text that was allegedly written by Song Ruoxing and annotated by her sister Ruo Zhao, two erudite women who were raised in a strict Confucian environment. We're still towards the end of, between the 8th and 9th century, so towards the end of the Tang dynasty. And they even ended up giving up their marriage to take on official positions at Emperor Dezong's court, something that, if I'm not mistaken, it's a similar fate to the one that Ban Zhao also shared. Anyway, that she was working a court, although I believe it was a little bit different because I think she was married and a widow. Anyway, the authorship of this unquestionably influential work is still the subject of an ongoing debate. So we have some scholars who believe that it could be a later forgery because it doesn't really appear written in a form of dialogue, as instead stated in the official histories. It also appears that the original edition comprised only 10 chapters, so 2 less than the existing version that we've got. As you can see here, we have 2 more chapters: harmony and gentleness, and preserving one's integrity. While the controversy has not yet been set, it has been speculated that the current edition could be an explanation, so a shenshi, Ruo Zhao compiled for her sister work, written in colloquial language so as to reach a broader audience. While in a more recent study, a scholar called Yamazaki argued that the text might actually be authored by a woman called Madame Wei, who was the wife of the 9th century poet Xue Meng, and it was still based on Ban Zhao's Nüjie. Both the nüxun and the nüxun actually make use of Ban Zhao's authoritative voice to establish an ideal dialogue with young unmarried ladies and to impart a series of moral lessons which would enable them to perform all the duties required in their new family roles. Due to the modest literacy of the readership, these texts were written in a clear, if colloquial language, although they also included quotations from other canonical works. The literary and pedagogical value of the nüxun and the nüxun was meant to transcend the Tang period, because we see that during the Ming Dynasty, these 2 texts became part of the canon for women called the nüxun, so the 4 books for women, alongside obviously Nüjie by Ban Zhao and Empress Ren Xiaowen's nüxun, Instructions for the Inner Quarters, published in 1405. So the nüxun, it appears evident that they are basically a sort of a tribute to they echo the Neo-Confucian canon codified during the Song dynasty, thus conferring indisputable authority to their precepts. Then the canon, we should also point out that the canon changed eventually, and nüxun was replaced by another text, also another nüxun text, also published during the Ming dynasty. So the final text on which I based my investigation, and I'm sorry I'm taking so much to provide an overview of the background basically of my research, but I found this text really interesting because it's the product of a different cultural context, something that demonstrates that the instruction of children was a preoccupation that united all social strata and was perceived just as strongly at the center as it was in the periphery of the empire. We have now moved to Dunhuang, so the first stop of the Silk Road going out of China, or obviously the last coming to China, where the recent excavations, brought to light a florid educational environment with evidence of a complex network of schools, institutions, and approximately 250 texts, which were aimed at the instruction of children. And in particular, there are 110 books on moral conduct. Most precepts addressing girls' moral cultivation are scattered throughout the various Tang Jiaosun, and one of these is Tai Gong Jia Jiao, if I'm not the one that I mentioned before. But there is one complete nüxun, which is called Cui Shi Fu Zhen Xun Nu Wen. So Madame Cui's essay for instructing girls, which I will hereinafter call Cui Shi Fu Zhen. This is a short nüxun poem. There we go, this is the text. A short nüxun poem that was popular in Dunhuang towards the end of the Tang dynasty. It is a 7-character rhymed essay written by an anonymous woman on the day of her daughter's wedding, or at least depicting the day of her daughter's wedding. The name in the title is thought to be an alias, as the Cuis were one of the most prominent families in the northeast, whose women were regarded as highly desirable spouses by most scholar officials, as mentioned by Zheng Enju and Zhao, so the two studies on which I based my knowledge on this text. The background at least. Given the popularity of the text among common families in Dunhuang, in particular, Zhu suggests that the poem was composed by an aristocratic woman in the capital and was somehow copied and put on the market, as attested to by the Li printing house seal, rediscovered on one of the 3 editions of the work. Madame Cui's teachings are presented through the touching words of a mother to her parting daughter, whose tears reveal the reality behind the overly celebrated rite of marriage. It's like, in a way, it's a text that wants to provide comfort, but also warning, obviously, exhortations, if you want, and advice for this daughter who is about to embark, to walk through, let's say, this important transition gate, this kind of rite of transition. The text is written in a simple language and deals with tropes recurring in other nüxun books, such as moral conduct, the relationship with the husband and the in-laws, and the importance of womanly work, thus restating that gender-specific expectations, so in particular expectations towards young girls on the verge of getting married, transcended social status and personal background. And in order to understand what characterized Tang female instruction, particularly in comparison with the Han period, and also to see in what way precepts and practices were influenced by the sociocultural environment of the time, this study will draw from the aforementioned nüxun text to redefine women's roles and relations in 3 specific contexts: in the natal family, within the natal family, within the husband's family, and in the social dimension of women's life. Obviously, due to time restrictions, I will just present and discuss the natal family as a case study. But I should also say that This study has been published in form of paper on the Journal of Journal of the European Association of Chinese Studies on the second volume 2 years ago, no, at the end of 2021. So yeah, a bit more than 2 years ago, and it's available in open access. So. Expectations and education surround the natal family. How do these three and other nüxun texts, which I have consulted, talk about education of girls, and in particular their role as daughters? As previously observed, female instruction remained strictly relegated to the inner chambers, even as the structure and composition of family units changed over time. And again, discusses the main purpose of basically the main purpose was the cultivation of the Fu Dao, the wifely way, which integrated rules of conduct, literary skills, and housework, so the Gong, and prepared young girls for the turning point they all shared in their lives, which was obviously marriage. Marriage was the rite of passage, as I said before, that marked the transition from being someone's daughter to becoming someone's wife, with all the pressure and responsibility that came with being incorporated into another family. And I'm quoting here, as a daughter at home, you used to receive love and tenderness. Today, as someone's wife, you ought to believe in predestination. This is something that has been stated in Swish Furen, and as we can see, this in these lines, the Buddhist concept of yuan feng, so destiny or predestined affinity relationship, is introduced in a way in order to convey a sense of ineluctability to the marital bond. But it's also interesting because it's the first time. It's the first time I believe that this concept is actually introduced or is actually used in a nüxun text. It's not a unicum, anyway, a unique situation, as we also find the same term in the Nü Yu, where it is said that, I'm quoting, what was set by fate in a previous life today results in marriage. And this showcase, it's a way to showcase, and it really shows the influence of the syncretic religious environment of the time on these literary texts. The concept of yuan feng is obviously not something that we find, in earlier texts, like for instance Nü Jie, or also in later texts produced during the Ming Dynasty. With regards to the implications that marriage had on the relationship between the bride and her natal family, there is historical evidence that this bond was not to be completely severed after the wedding. There are studies such as by Chen Ruoshui and Brett Hinch, who point out that matrilocal residence was quite common during the Tang Dynasty, and wives were actually encouraged to pay regular visits to their parents, even if they were legally members of the husband's household. This is also hinted in the following couplet of the Tuishe Furen, where it is said, and I'm quoting, "The fragrant carriage and treasured horse compete in splendor, while you, my daughter, weep in sincere sorrow in front of the ancestral hall. Today I urge you not to cry, for 3 days after the wedding you will be able to return for a visit." So this kind of shows how relationships with the natal family, so becoming a daughter, was still a part of women's life even after being married, although obviously with less importance. Given the prominent value attributed to marriage and the social expectations associated with it, it is not surprising that the most popular nüxun texts emphasize the role of wife and educator of children, of course, over that of daughter. An exception to this trend can be seen in the Nü Yu, which clearly indicated that the natal family was the origin of the education, and reserved the first 5 chapters for the duties and moral qualities a daughter needed to cultivate. Chapter 1 stated that a girl's priority was to establish a person, Li Shen, through fostering chastity and tranquility. Only after mastering proper conduct and understanding this differentiation, I'm quoting, men and women should manage the inner and outer sphere respectively. This is something that we find also as early as the Book of Rites. Only after this, understanding this, could a girl become familiar with womanly work, the nüxun, and the etiquette. And while being diligent at housework and carrying on the family ancestral rites were also crucial stages of Banjao's educational process, she believed personal cultivation began with a woman becoming aware of her lowly and weak status, Beirut, and bracing for a lifetime of sacrifice and service and unrewarded sacrifice. This is just a quote from what Nüjie says about sort of gender specific awareness. She says, I'm quoting, on the third day after the birth of a girl, the ancients let her sleep on the ground below the bed, let her play with a tile from a weaving machine. To let her sleep below the bed, it's to make clear that she is lowly and weak and that she should place herself beneath others. To let her play with a tile from a weaving machine is to indicate unmistakably that she should be accustomed to labor and be diligent in her work. So we can see quite a change of tone between the two works. The song Sisters focus on daughters' duties culminates in chapter 5, serving one's parents. At home, girls were expected to look after the parents' well-being, attending to their food and clothes, and assisting them, particularly when they were ill. All these filial acts, which, as we can see, carry, the legacy from the Li, demonstrate that the Tang women were perceived as more than just wives, while their natal family was credited for providing the natural environment to train them in the Sansong Si, so in the 3 obediences and the 4 virtues. After all, a daughter's success or failure in her wifely duties had an inevitable effect on her family's reputation. As eloquently summarized in the eulogy of the assistant minister's Bai, which concluded the Tuishi Fujian, I'm quoting, if a bride lacks education, the fault falls on her parents. And as I was mentioning, I won't really have the chance in this occasion to delve into the husband's family and also the social dimension, but I would like to share with you some concluding remarks. I'm hoping that the above examination, although certainly partial, showcased at least how Tang family instruction reshaped the role and relations of women. They were no longer merely depicted in the role of subservient wives. In comparison, I'm talking obviously with the Han dynasty, but then again, also when we look at how this text evolved during the Song and in particular during the Ming period. So they're also depicted as filial daughters with a particular emphasis on the relationship with their parents and on how the education they received from the family prepared them for marriage and their future responsibilities. These Tang nüxun texts also indicated, and this is something again that I didn't have a chance to talk about today, but they do show that parents-in-law were the actual center of the husband's family and consistently highlighted winning their affection as a fresh bride's primary duty rather than just focusing, on kind of pleasing her husband or basically pleasing her, serving her parents-in-law as a route, if you want, to her husband's heart. The marital bond was considered the foundation of the 5 human relationships, but appeared more reciprocal than hierarchical, as instead depicted in the Han texts. Wife devotion for the husbands was no longer based on the cosmological order between heaven and earth and the hierarchical status of yin and yang, but was instead justified by sincere affection, since the relationship appeared being actually already predestined. And finally, while women's main sphere of agency was still the inner chambers, they were no longer precluded from social interactions, although they still needed to conform to a strict guest-host etiquette. So this is not just what's important to remember is that all these rules and norms of conduct and so forth did not just die or kind of were exhausted, were confined between the borders of the Tang Empire, which was already quite big. But because of the influence that Tang China had over the neighbors or the neighboring countries in that period, we do find that a lot of these precepts contain a lot of these texts. For instance, the Nüluyu and the New Xiaojin were also adopted as canon for female instruction in countries like today's Japan and Korea, thus influencing the role of women and gender differentiation, not just, as I said, within Chinese borders, but throughout the whole East Asia area. So this is certainly something that deserves further investigation. Shall leave you with a quick glimpse on some of the particularly secondary sources that I used, and I would like to thank you for your attention.